Hey there, so here is like a super rudimentary foliage demo. What I have right now set up is a demo level. It's basically the line level with a big old mesh over here and all the existing foliage removed. So we're just going to look at kind of like the basic overview of how to use the foliage tool, how to adjust settings with the individual foliage meshes in order to get the best results, and how to add, remove, and use all of the different elements that you would need to set up your foliage. So let's come over here to the foliage tool, this tab right here, 4 over from the top or from the right. You can see right here that we have 5 foliage meshes already set up. You can import your own foliage meshes just by dragging it in. So like really fast, I have my folder pulled up here with a static mesh. It's literally just a static mesh with its alpha cards and stuff already, everything set up. So I'm just going to drag that in, and there you go. There's the foliage, and now you can place and do whatever. But for right now, we're just going to focus on kind of like the basics. So let's start from the top. We've got some brush settings, brush size, pretty self-explanatory. Got a larger brush size, got a larger brush, you know. So paint density is a little more complicated, but essentially you have paint density and you have your foliage density, and both of those correspond to each other. The foliage density is applied to whatever your paint density is. So let's increase the brush size here. So a 0.13 paint density would look pretty sparse, whereas a 1 would look pretty solid. And then erase density is just the same for the eraser. So you paint it in just with the right or left mouse button, and you erase by holding shift and painting. The only other thing that you're needing to know here is single instance mode. Let's say you don't want to like paint in, like even if you get like super small with your brush size, there's really nothing stopping it from like putting in more than one mesh. But let's say you only want one mesh here or here or here, and you don't want to like drag it around, you want to paint it in, because when you paint it in with the foliage tool, you're not actually putting a mesh in a level, you're putting an instanced static foliage mesh in, which is a lot cheaper than a new mesh because you're just referencing whatever foliage you have designated. So let's say you only want one. You can come over here to single instance mode, and you can just put in whatever you want, single meshes, wherever, just like that. But for right now, that's unnecessary. So now that we've looked at our brush options, look at our filters. So filters. Right now I have it to only draw on static meshes. So like if I come over here to the actual level, the landscape, you'll notice that it's only putting grass on the meshes in the level, which can be super useful, especially if you want to avoid all the static meshes. So let's say that I'm painting in grass or foliage for the level itself. I obviously don't want grass sitting on top of any of these rocks or on top of the fences. So what I would do is I'd come over here and select only landscape. And so when I paint it in, it's going to avoid all of the meshes or the static meshes in the level and only paint on the landscape. And you can select or deselect however many you want here in the filter menu to get the result that you're looking for. So now that we've done that, let's take a look at some of the different options in the foliage menu. This is like kind of the bread and butter of the foliage tool itself, and that's why you can get a result like, like this from a mesh that looks like this. So there's a pretty big difference. So let's go over that for a second. So let's erase that. Let's get this out of here. So we're going to deselect that. We're going to select this grass mesh right here. And just because my resolution is pretty bad, I'm going to kind of like push all of these windows out of the way. Turn this down. So you can see right here, once you import a mesh into the foliage tool, you have a few options. The first one here is going to designate whatever mesh you have. That will come in with whatever you drag in, and you have your painting. Now if you notice, there's a density here and there's a density for here in the paint tool. It's kind of difficult to like distinguish between the two, so the best way I can use to describe it is the paint tool is painting in like a 0 to 1 kind kind of grayscale map, and then the grass is being assigned to that map. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you can set your paint density, you can set your individual grass density. It all just depends how you want to approach things. I typically keep my paint density really high, and then I adjust my individual grass densities just to get more specific clusters. So under that, we've got radius. Radius is basically just the distance in between foliage actors. So let's say you want bushes or something. You can turn this pretty far up. Wham. Turn the density pretty far down. We're actually setting it so far now that it's only spawning one mesh. But like you can kind of see that now the radius in between, or the distance in between the meshes is pretty wide. But that's kind of unnecessary for grass because you want things pretty tightly clumped. So I keep that at 0. Scaling. So we're going for a more uniform look. So this is kind of something that isn't used too much, but variation is essentially, or sorry, scaling is essentially just variation. So if you have things set to uniform, that means everything's going to be uniformly scaled. But let's say we set this to 0.1 and 2.9. So what we're doing is we're randomly assigning a scalar value for the x, y, and z for our grass mesh that is multiplied by either 1 or 2.9. And so this is going to look super chunky and crazy. We have things that are scaled super far down and things that are scaled really, really high. Let me see if I can get a better example of this. So you can't really see the smaller ones because they're so small that they're actually not being displayed. But yeah, it's basically if you want more variation in your grass, you set this. I typically have this at, like if I have a good size for my grass and I don't want to mess with it too much and I want it to stay pretty uniform, I typically keep it within a couple tenths of each other. So like I'll do 0.8 to 1.2. And that keeps things like varied enough to be believable, but not noticeably chunky and different. So next we have Z offset. That basically determines the variation in which your grass foliage is sunken in or pushed up over where you're painting. So I mean, there are certain grass mesh, or there's certain foliage meshes that are fine, like if you're painting in rocks or something and you want them sunken in. But for the most part, if you can see the grass just sticking out of like a flat mesh or a landscape, it looks super shitty. So I typically keep it at 0, but there are some cases where you'd want your grass sunken in or pushed up or floating up. Align to normal, pretty self-explanatory. It just aligns the grass so it's not sitting flat on your curved surface. Let's do a little landscape thing. So notice how all of these are flat and they're not conforming themselves to the slope. Well, that's just because they're not aligned to the normal. Random pitch. Basically most of these in placement are just assigning random variables or random variants to your grass. So all of the different instances of grass that you're painting in have some variety to them, whether it's in the rotation, whether it's in the yaw, whether it's in the angle, or whether it's in the scale. Height and ground slope are typically things that you don't want to mess with too much, but I will give an example. So you see how it's not painting in on these like sheer walls or sheer cliffs. That's because of this right here, which is ground slope angle, and basically this is saying that any slope that's greater than 45 degrees it's not going to paint grass on. Sometimes you want foliage to be on walls or on sheer walls, and sometimes a foliage tool is kind of like dumb and doesn't give you like solid paint, especially with like smaller hills like this. So like over here there's just a big splotch and there's like no way to paint that in. So what you're gonna have to do here is like turn this way up. There's really no reason to have it like whatever, and then you should be able to paint it in. It can get a little weird, but just increasing this number to infinity is honestly the best way to go about that, because there's really no downside. You're just basically saying just paint on whatever I want painted on, disregard the angle. Coal distance, that's kind of like delving into LODs a little bit. That's just telling unreal how far out from your camera vector you want grass or foliage to be rendered. If we do end up doing any like LOD stuff or like anything where we're like unloading unloading any like unseen foliage, I would probably recommend not doing it in the foliage setting. That's probably something that you would want to do in a blueprint, just because this doesn't have a lot of, this is pretty like cut and dry, and there's not much flexibility with it. And all the rest are just cast shadow. I have all of them cast shadow turned off. It kind of like darkens the foliage a lot, and I don't know. Having shadows on your grass kind of breaks the illusion of having stylized grass, and it kind of makes it like separates the grass meshes from the landscape, which is something that you don't want to do. But once you start casting shadows and all these start opening up, dynamic shadow, static shadow, all this fun stuff that is super expensive when you are dealing with, you know, foliage actors that are now like approaching like 100,000 instance actors in one level that are all casting shadows. So typically have that turned off. But if you do have it on, I would recommend not having dynamic shadows. But all of this can be adjusted per foliage as well. So like, let's say that we don't want the grass actor to cast shadows, but we do want our bigger foliage to cast shadows. Like, let's say we have like big vines or like the tree or like leaves or something. We want those to cast shadows. We can just go to whatever foliage or whatever instanced thing we have for that specific foliage type and just come down and select cast shadow for that. So now that we've like touched most of the options here in the foliage tool, I think it would be good to like look at how I'm personally handling the grass. So let's open up our grass right here. So right now, I'm going to take this off and put lighting only. What we've got here is a collection of alpha cards, just flat 2D planes that have a texture applied to them, and that texture is boop, 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 boop. Actually, I can just open it through the material. Right here. So this texture here is the top 4 grass shapes that people agreed on, and they're texture packed, so there's 1 alpha per channel. And they're being brought into this material right here. And this is, I think this is the material folder. This is basically just running some colors, some gradients, and the texture itself through this wind function. And then that's being spit out into the kind of bread and butter of these grass instances. So right now I have 5 different grass meshes, and the reason I have 5, they're all identical with the exception of the material on each of them. The reason why I have 5 individual grass meshes, even though they're all the same, is so I can come in and apply different instances or different materials to each one and get a different grass and be able to paint those in separately. So let's go to the main grass right here. See, that is a different texture than this right here, which is a different texture than this right here. So they're all different, and if I wanted to, I can even select them all and paint them all in at the same time, just like that, which is nice. But that just allows for some variety and some like just hot swapping instead of having to like change textures and stuff. So going back to the grass shader, there's not a lot that most people will need to do in the grass shader, because the way I set it up is for all the heavy lifting to be done by the instances. So the instances are over in the material grass folder, boo, 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 right here, stylized instances. So all of these instances, these 4, are being taken from that one grass shader right here, right? And basically the differences between each of these 4 instances is that they're each taking a different channel out of that texture pack grass. So they're all the same material. They're only calling that material once. We're just now instancing that material, so we're not having to like call 4 different versions of the same thing. So we go to each one. I mean, we could come in here and like for each instance, and it doesn't just have to be limited to 4. You can have as many instance materials as you want. You can come in here and adjust things like roughness, specularity, texture scale, which I actually used pretty heavily in the last one, or the last iteration of grass, where you can make it taller, or this isn't taller. You can make it skinnier, taller, whatever, within reason, because then you start wrapping the UVs. And then you can adjust the colors and all the other bullshit I have set up in here. But yeah, and so because we have all those different instances, now we can come into our actual grass mesh, and we can actually designate all those different instances in the mesh. So we can have variety in the mesh, we can have variety in the foliage tool itself. It's really versatile in however way you want to approach it. Personally, the way that I've been handling it right now is I've been keeping all of my individual grass meshes, just for the sake of my own sanity, as one instance. So like if you come through here, these are all the same. Instance 1A, instance 1A, instance 1A. But if I really wanted to, I could come through here and start like switching in different instances to get more variation in my individual grass meshes. You can set the variety of your grass texture in the actual mesh itself because of the way that I've set up the material IDs, or you can set them in the foliage tool over here. So it's really however you want to do it. I think that's basically everything I wanted to cover with the foliage tool. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Slack or anywhere I'm online. Cool. Thank you.